Testing. Okay, hello folks. So today in class, I will be starting the day with the medical appointment. So I'm not sure if I will be able to get to class on time. So to be on the safe side, I thought I'd record my presentation. So without further ado, here it goes. So for our class on evil, I have a few things to address. Who is Emily Towns? Specifically, what is the text that we're addressing today? And what is the context of this text? And my take on the arguments. I will try to be as summary as I can. And reflections on either Emily Towns or her arguments. I think I'll address both. And then suggest some discussion questions. So let's begin with at the beginning. Who the heck is Emily Towns? Well, there's a picture of her, and she is the dean E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter, professor of Womanist Ethics and Society at the Vanderbilt University Divinity School. Mouthful. Let's see. She was the first African-American woman to be elected president of the American Academy of Religion in 2008. She served as the president of the Society for the Study of Black Religion from 2012 to 2016, president of the Society of Christian Ethics, 224 to 225. So she's quite accomplished. The textbook I'll be talking about, Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil. And the context. Well, she's a Baptist minister. She is known for her scholarship in terms of womanism and ethics. And she is very heavily influenced by postmodernism. So, my take on the arguments. Well, I perceive that there's two types of material in this book. There is material that is an actual argument, qua argument. Chapter 1 sets out the goal and purpose of the study. Chapter 2 sets out key terminology, and Chapter 8 sets out conclusions. Chapters 3 to 7 are case studies of common stereotypical tropes about Black womanhood. So I'll elaborate on the goals and the terminology. I will set out what I think are the key points of the case studies and her conclusion. But because time isn't a factor, I've got a lot of material on my slides, but I might only hit 2 or 3 of them when I get to the case studies. So, under time pressure here, her ultimate goal is that she observes that the key way to understand evil is to concentrate on particularities rather than universals, and that accounts for her use of case studies. She is exploring evil as a cultural production, setting out to gain access to the interior life of evil and offer suggestions on how to dismantle it. So she's got quite a course ahead of her. And she will focus on the interplay of history and memory, specifically the notion of history as being subjective, and understand evil as a cultural production. And she states that counter memory is an important tool to dismantle evil. By counter memory, it seems that she is referring to reinstilling things that have been fallen out of the official historical record that counter the received historical narrative. So, in terms of her terminology in chapter 2, she makes a distinction between fact and truth versus fact and fiction. For her, history is static and memory is dynamic, and memory is absolute and history is relative. I think a lot of historians might disagree with her. But that said, she observes that microhistories are so deemed because the larger society selects certain markers in the past and invests them with symbolic, political, and theological significance while ignoring others. We've got a couple recent examples of that. Civil rights leaders are concerned about various articles being removed from the Smithsonian African American Museum, for example. Similarly, Pentagon history is purging stories that involve anyone who they consider DEI, which I think is very troubling. So memory may become a kind of counter-history that challenges a false generalization of exclusionary history. A couple more key terms. Fantastic, as she's using it, is not limited to the worlds of literature, but goes beyond to form a part of the cultural production of our realities. It is in the very fabric of the everyday. And it includes structures of domination and subordination. So, and hegemony, as she defines it, is the set of ideas that dominant groups employ in a society to secure the consent of subordinates to abide by their rule. This cartoon is an apt illustration, I think. So let me point out that whenever politicians hold forth about culture wars, that's effectively what they're doing. Instead of encouraging people to make common cause to improve society as a whole, they pick areas of conflict and encourage this conflict. So, and counter memory seeks to open up not only these versus spaces of counter hegemony, it argues also for reconstitution of history. The notion is that history is, in a sense, a received narrative, and that narrative has been defined by whoever has power at the given moment. So, let me just hit on the case studies very briefly, and I might even skip some of these points here. So, in chapter 3, she sets out to deconstruct the stereotypes of the mammy, as in this image from Gone with the Wind, and the commercial icon of Aunt Jemima. Here's all the various permutations of that logo. Well, she makes a point that Aunt Jemima was picking up on the mammy stereotype, which basically derogated older Black women as asexual and more devoted to the well-being of their white charges than they were to their families. And she points out the counter memory that provides further context for the original meaning and significance of these tropes, which were lost when appropriated by white popular culture. The irony is that the minstrel shows picked up on a lot of images from African American culture, but they misunderstood that these images were actually making fun or putting down or criticizing the white hegemonic culture. Let's see, next case study. Postmodernism challenges our focus on individuals and a historical reason. And she observes that race is not natural, biological, or psychological, but it does exist. I love this use of paradox. Whiteness is a social construct. As a white person, never thought of it that way, but it's a valid point. She talks about the rise of white supremacy at the time that she was writing, which was during the Bush administration. But folks, I hate to break this to you, it's getting even worse now. So, three major shifts she sees. The original form of racism was essentialist and assumed hierarchical biological inequalities. The second major shift she saw was the notion that we are all the same under the skin, fine so far as it goes, but it blamed a failure to live up to that sameness and achieve it as the fault of colored people. I am quoting her. The third shift, though, she identifies appeals to the difference, but marks the varying autonomy of cultures, values, and aesthetics. This brings the inequities of the social structure into mix. So we have here two kinds of racism, essentialism, but then also this notion of color blindness, which ironically has been twisted to condemn and criticize African American people. So She believes that the way to address this is by increasing our knowledge of history. And her case study in this case is the character of Sapphire. Sapphire, this is an image of the actress who played Sapphire, and she was a character not only on the Amos and Andy TV show, but our writer has overlooked the fact that years and years before that, the TV show was a spin-off of a very popular radio show. And it was common knowledge that the people that played Amos and Andy, portrayed as two African-American men, were themselves actually white. So it was essentially blackface on radio. But the point is interesting because I'm not sure if we can. I looked up the actress who played Sapphire, and she actually did not think that she was playing a stereotype. She thought that their show, Amos and Andy, which had an entirely black cast, was opening the door for other black performers to make greater headway in Hollywood. So, case history 5. We look at the tragic mulatto, which, as portrayed by white writers, and I think this also includes Mark Twain in the novel Pudd'nhead Wilson. But it was also portrayed, though, as a triumphant character for Black writers because a mulatta could easily cross racial lines. So she observes that Christian triumphalism, American ahistoricity, and the ideology of empire, not the same thing as imperialism, according to her, puts our country in a similar tension because at the same time, the people want to affirm the country as a Christian country. They also want to affirm a tacit kind of empire. And she points out that if we really look at the roots of Christianity, which rose up as a counter movement against the hegemony of the Roman Empire, that might be a corrective for this tendency. Let's go on to case history 5, chapter 6. And she's looking at the Black matriarch and the welfare queen. And she makes the point that makers of public policies on poverty are unaware of the religious values that form their roots. She traces that to Calvin's formulation of the work ethic, but that has loosed public policies that focus on unrestrained individualism, personal responsibility, and despise any hint of dependency, like in this recent news story, in which Elon Musk reposted a meme saying people that benefit from federal programs are the parasite class. Because, of course, if you are at any point dependent in your life for any reason, you are a parasite. And it ignores structural evil and blames the victim. So how can we retrieve this? She points out that Calvin had a contrary notion of work as a calling or vocation, work as service to others, and work as both communal as communal instead of individual. And this chapter is very political. She criticizes President Bush's policies and prescribes that we should yoke our individual selves with the matrix of life with others. Community should be a site for strength and meaning versus competition and domination. Next case study. This one will be relatively brief. Growing Topsy deconstructs the image of Topsy from Uncle Tom's Cabin. I must admit, I didn't know before I read this that Topsy was a character in that novel. Also, I didn't know that this was the basis of the expression growing up like Topsy or topsy-turvy. So the character was intended to evoke sympathy, but it was distorted in popular culture as the image of a happy slave. And it is an example of erasing history to maintain the hegemony. We are currently facing a current example of that. The current administration is deleting government web pages that praise people like Harriet Tubman and the Tuskegee Airmen because they are being deemed DEI. Well, we need to recover the history of Black communities, and we need to cultivate an atmosphere that does not view difference as a barrier. Now, as a sci-fi geek, I have to say that mention that looks awfully familiar to me. I think IDIC, infinite diversity and infinite combinations from Star Trek, is a good example of that kind of thing. So, dismantling the cultural production of evil then. This is our conclusion, and she recommends that we begin working on ourselves and accept that the fantastic hegemonic imagination, that's a mouthful, exists within us, not outside, that these stereotypes continue to have force because people accept them and buy them without questioning. She cites the problem of hierarchy and a tacit goal of individual victory, which seems to me very similar to the notion of hegemonic masculinity. What we're seeing in certain political circles is a very narrow version of masculinity, which is all about conquest and dominance and tacit threat of violence. And I think that's a huge problem. We need a new vision based on justice and peace, and this must be a collective group project. We finally get some specific recommendations, though. Truth-telling, which the fantastic hegemonic imagination does not count on, we should refuse to acquiesce to demonic stereotypes and combine challenge with hope and understand that change is a daily practice. It's not something that comes from without, it comes from within, and it's a matter of ongoing discipline. So, and think, for some reason that image isn't working. So Jimi Hendrix famously observed that when the power of love overcomes the love of power, then we will know peace. I think Hendrix was ahead of our writer by a couple decades, but I think the point is valid nonetheless. So let me give you a couple of reflections about her and her arguments. As a writer and scholar, some of her passages are extremely lucid and indeed almost poetic. She does have some interesting quirks. I thought it was interesting that one chapter was written as free verse, and it's interesting that she devoted an entire footnote to the steps of the dance, the electric slide. Where else are you likely to find that? In academia. Now, that being said, when I was preparing the studying to do this presentation, I looked up a number of reviews of this book to see if it would help clarify some of the passages I found a bit obscure. And you know what? A number of critics not have noted an overuse of what they call academies, which creates a challenge for the lay reader. It might be fine and good if the person reading it is one who is well steeped in postmodernism, but even I found some of these tropes a little challenging to figure out. But let's turn to the overall argument. Case studies shed a light and provide additional context for common negative tropes about African American women in culture. But I have to raise the problem. Is the title perhaps too broad? Maybe instead of the cultural production of evil, which would seem to indicate that all evil is produced culturally, it would be more accurate to talk about this book as addressing examples of culturally produced evil. Or am I being a bit too punctilious here? The case studies do a commendable job of highlighting negative and sometimes poisonous stereotypes, and provided me some insight about some of these stereotypes that I had not encountered before, so kudos for that. But I have to raise the question. she is citing some very specific examples of a specific kind of evil, which is created by culture, specifically hegemonic imagery. But isn't there much more to evil than that? You'll note that she doesn't talk about natural evil at all. And I think there are evils that are much more extensive. Let me point out that, give you an example. Perhaps a more encompassing, more universal expression of the nature of evil can be cited in the work of Immanuel Kant. Always recognize that human individuals are ends and do not use them as means to an end. I think that is perhaps more to the essence of what the nature of evil is. That being said, these stereotypes that she talks about are actually a pretty good example because that reduces an individual to a received image. It does not honor them as an individual. Perhaps a more accessible way, I think, of articulating the same concept comes from one of my favorite authors, Terry Pratchett. Yes, popular fiction, also a fantasy author, but he often imported a lot of philosophy into his popular novels. So we have this quote. One of his more popular characters, Granny Weatherwax, is quoted in one of his novels as saying, "Sin, young man, is when you treat people like things, including yourself. That's what sin is." Your interlocutor says it's a lot more complicated than that, but she replies, no, it ain't. When people say things are a lot more complicated than that, they mean they're getting worried that they won't like the truth. People as things, that's where it starts. Oh, I'm sure there are worse crimes, he replies, but she states, but they starts with thinking about people as things. I think that's a broader and more, well, it's a more popular way of articulating what Immanuel Kant said 200 or 300 years ago, but I think it comes down to the same essence. I think these case studies give us examples of a particular type of culturally produced evil, but I don't think they are exhaustive or representative of the essence of evil, which I would take as being a little wider, broader, deeper, and nastier. So finally, discussion questions. Well, if this was one of the classes I was teaching, I would challenge my students to identify in class what problems are being cited, what solutions are being proposed, and evaluate whether those solutions make sense. For you all, these are the questions I would be inclined to ask. What do you think of the quality of writing? Is there an over reliance on academies, as some critics have stated, or is it lucid, or is it a bit of both? In a class, I would draw out both positions. Personally, I think there are wonderfully brilliant and lucid passages, but there are some passages that are so obscure, I end up scratching my own head. So, how does the overall argument stand up? Are there issues with definitions, premises, grounds, logic, or conclusions? This is what I tell my students is the basis for the critique of a polemic. You look at each one of these and see if they hold up. Would the suggestions and the conclusions suffice? Again, I think there's room for argument. I think she makes some quality suggestions, but some of them, I'm not sure how plausible or applicable they are. And do the case studies help or hinder the points that she's making? Could she have done with fewer case studies, or would even more case studies be an asset to support her points? How could these ideas and observations be implemented to minimize this kind of culturally produced evil? So there's my presentation for what it's worth. I will share this on YouTube and share the link with our professor. And if I'm too late for class, well, welcome to my YouTube channel. Ciao for now.